This podcast is produced by the Harwood Productions Podcast Network. To learn more about the network and to find more of our shows, visit us online at www.harwoodpodcast.com. This episode of SketchUp, a 3D Toolbox, is brought to you by 3D Connection, makers of the Space Navigator. To learn more about the best way to navigate in SketchUp, visit 3dconnection.com. Hey there guys, and welcome back to another episode of SketchUp, a 3D Toolbox. I'm Cameron Harris, and this is episode number 57. In our last episode, we finished off our Cahuilla Falls house series, which was an absolutely amazing project to work on. But today, we're starting another series that I am equally excited about. We're going to be remodeling an apartment. Now this is a little bit different from anything we've done in the past. What we've done in the past is either creating something from scratch or taking an existing building or room from the real world and turning it into a 3D model in SketchUp, replicating it in 3D exactly. We're going to be doing that as well in this series, but we're going to be going one step further. We're going to replicate the apartment as it looks right now, specifically the living room. We're just going to focus in one big room. We're going to replicate that in SketchUp, furniture, walls, the whole 9 yards, and then we're going to modify that in SketchUp to make something completely new. This is something that I personally have done a lot. Anytime I'm doing anything in a room, even if it's just moving a couch from one side of the room to the other, something very simple, I always plot it out in SketchUp first because it's much easier to move furniture in a 3D environment on your computer than it is to actually push it across the room. And then you can see what you like, what you don't like, and what works. This can be great for a personal project, or if you are a professional, an interior designer or an architect, this can be a great way to show a client what it is you're thinking without actually having to commit all the time and energy into making it a reality. Now, the first thing we're going to do is measure this room that I'm standing in right now and make it in SketchUp. Now, this is something else that we haven't really done before. I realized I've never shown you guys how to use a tape measure and measure the dimensions of a room and input that into SketchUp. We've always worked off of a floor plan or just kind of come up with some dimensions off the top of our heads. This time I'm going to show you how I go about measuring a room and inputting those measurements into SketchUp. So let's start off by taking a look at the apartment we're going to be modeling. Now, we're not going to be modeling the whole thing, as I said before. We're just going to be modeling the living room. That's the area that we're going to be redoing. It's a pretty standard situation to find yourself in. You usually don't remodel an entire house. It's usually just one room at a time. At least that's far more common. So that's what we'll be doing. Now, you can see that there are other rooms off of the living room. There's a kitchen and there's a hallway. We need to model those because we want to be able to see them and kind of have some context rather than just a blank hole in the wall instead of a room. But we don't need to add detail. We don't need to take really accurate measurements of those. They just need to be placeholders. So when I'm measuring a room, I always start in a corner. And I like to start off with the simplest corner. So I'm not going to start where the hallway is or where the entry to the kitchen is. That's a bit too complicated. I want to start off with a very simple corner. And in this case, I'm going to be doing the corner where the sliding glass door wall and the window wall meet. So I'm going to go ahead and measure across. And I'm doing the window side in this case, measuring across. And as we can see here, that wall is going to be 14 feet and 2 inches long. So I'm going to hop into SketchUp, and I have my laptop with SketchUp right here, and you can also see I have my trusty Space Navigator by 3D Connection. That's how I can move so fluidly and smoothly through the SketchUp world. And I'm going to hop into a new project, get rid of this lovely guy right here, switch to the line tool by hitting the L key, and I'm going to start at the axis. This is that corner that I'm going to start with, and I'm going to start drawing a line off, snap it to the red axis, and I'm going to go ahead and type in 14'2". That's 14 feet, 2 inches, and click. Excellent. So now I've got that, and you can see I'm ready to draw another line if I want to, and I'm going to leave it like that actually, because the next thing I want to do is I want to measure that next wall where the media center is. So I'm going to go ahead and measure that, and that's actually a pretty similar measurement. It's 14 feet and 1/2 of an inch. When it comes to how accurate I measure things in SketchUp, I typically only measure things, at least in the real world that is, and then put them in SketchUp. Usually I only go by 1/2 inch. So 14'.5 for 1/2 inch. There we go. I usually don't get into 1/4 inches. I might if it's a really, really detail-y project, but usually I stick to just 1/2 inches, and that's usually fine. Now I'm going to go ahead and hit the escape key to cancel my next line here, because this right here is where that hallway would be. So if I just draw a rectangle so you can see what I'm talking about, this right here is that hallway. So I've measured only up to where the hallway starts. I didn't count the actual doorway there, and I'll show you why in a minute, because we don't actually need to measure that. So I'm going to leave that for now, and I'm going to go back over to this corner back here, and I'm going to jump over to where the sliding glass door is, and I'm going to measure that. In this case, it's 17 feet and 3 inches, so I'm going to go ahead and draw another line, 17'3". There we go. So you can see that's a really long line. And then I'm going to measure what'll actually be my last wall measurement for this whole apartment, and that's the front door wall. That is 7 feet and 11.5 inches. A bit precise there, so we're going to start there. 7'11.5 and go. So you might be wondering, well, why haven't you measured the rest of the room? You have other measurements that you haven't counted for yet. Well, I don't actually need to measure those, and this is where you can get a little bit sneaky with measuring, and this is why I also like to leave my more complicated walls that are a bit tricky to figure out for very last. Because you notice there's a wall right about here-ish. This would be the wall that divides the kitchen and the hallway, so that's what I need to really model next so I can figure out how big those doorways are, but I don't need to measure anything because I have the rest of the room. So I can figure out how big this stuff is just by process of elimination, essentially. It's sort of like, it's sort of like algebra. I was never a big fan of algebra personally, but if you know what enough of the variables are, you can figure out what x is, right? In this case, we know what the rest of the room is, so we know that this wall right here lines up with this wall and this wall. And to show you what I mean, I'm going to use the tape measure tool, hit the T key, switch to the tape measure tool, and draw out a line right here and line it up with this wall right here, this front door. Then I'll do the same thing over here and line it up with the media center wall. And you can see where these dotted lines, where these guides intersect, that is where that wall is going to be. That's where our kitchen is going to be here, and that's where our hallway is going to be here. So what I'm going to do for that is I'm going to go ahead and draw some lines. I'm going to just real quick, I'm just going to really roughly sketch this out. I'm not even measuring these walls. I'm just going to guess a little bit. 8 feet and 12 feet. There we go. Now, you might be wondering, why on earth are you just guessing at this? Well, we're not remodeling the kitchen. The kitchen is just there as sort of a visual guide for us, just so we know that something is here, but we don't need to know the specifics of it. I'm going to zoom in on my intersection right here. So this is where I want my wall to be. So I'm going to start a line right here, and these walls have a little bit of thickness, and they happen to be 4.5 inches. I measured that before, so I'm going to go 4.5 out, and I'm going to just take this in. I'm going to lock it to the red axis, and I'm just going to line it up with this wall over here, and there we go. Click. I'm going to do the same thing right here. I'm just going to take this, draw a line back to the same length, not that it really matters all that much. Lock it to the green axis, line it up here, and boom, there we go. And you can see that closed in my shape, and now I have a finished floor. So what we have here, this is the living room. This is accurate to the inch, to the ½ inch, and this is what we're going to be working with for the duration of this series. The rest of this over here, this is the kitchen, this is the hallway. These are not accurate, but they don't need to be. They just look accurate. But you can see, I can actually, with my tape measure tool, I can say right here, oh, the hallway is 3 feet 2.5 inches, and the kitchen entryway is 6 feet 2.5 inches. I know that because I did all the rest of these measurements, which means that's the only measurement that could possibly fit here. So I'm going to go ahead and delete my guidelines here, and I have my floor. I'm going to go ahead and right-click on it and choose Reverse Faces to make it white instead of purple. There we go. So this is my floor plan. Now, I don't actually have any walls here. To make walls, I need to offset this outwards 4.5 inches, because that's the thickness of my walls. So I'm going to switch the offset tool by hitting the F key, click once in my face, and then just expand it out like this. There we go. And type in 4.5. There we go. So that didn't change the dimensions of my internal shape. It just added a border around it of 4.5 inches. And that did add a couple extra lines here because I had already modeled this wall with depth, so I just need to get rid of these lines. There. Perfect. And then I'm going to go ahead and add some depth here. So I'm going to switch to the push-pull tool, P, select my middle face, that's my floor, and I'm going to pull it up. This doesn't really matter. I just like to add a little bit of thickness. It makes it a little bit easier to work with in the future. I'm just going to do 6 inches. There we go. My floor has some depth. Think of this as a foundation. Click on my outer wall, raise it up, and then just snap it to this so it's 6 inches. Now, I need to figure out how high my walls are. Now, this is something that we haven't really done before. We've always just gone with standard 8-foot walls. The truth is, very rarely, at least in my experience, are walls exactly 8 feet. Usually, like the flooring that's been done, in this case it's carpet, adds a little bit of thickness. Maybe the ceiling has sagged. Maybe it wasn't quite accurate. And in this case, I happen to know for a fact, I actually measured the ceilings. And I would recommend you always do that. It really helps so you can tell how much height you're actually working with. Especially if you want to do something like built-in bookcases, you want to know exactly how tall your walls are. And in this case, they're actually an inch shy of 8 feet. They are 7 feet and 11 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and type that in. There we go. And there is the basic, the structure of my apartment. So again, this hallway is, I can tell you for a fact, it's much deeper than this. And the kitchen, it's pretty close, but it doesn't need to be accurate. We're just concerned about this part right over here. But you'll notice that there is something missing. We don't have windows and we don't have doors. Well, there's one window on this wall, there's a sliding glass door on this wall, and there's the front door on this wall. And that's what we're going to do next, or at least we're going to prep for the windows and doors. We're not going to actually install them in this episode, that's next time, but we are going to cut some holes. Now, measuring things like doors and especially windows, because windows are floating in the middle of a wall. They aren't anchored to any side of the wall usually. That can mean a lot of measurements, a lot of really finicky measurements. And so I'm going to show you my technique that I use to figure out the size and the positioning of a window. To start off with, I like to measure from the left or right side of the wall, whichever is shorter, because shorter measurements are always easier to get. And I like to just figure out how far away, in this case from the left wall, the leftmost edge of my window is. And in this case, that's going to be 4 feet, 1.5 inches. So for windows and doors, I like to use guidelines for 90% of it. So I'm just going to select from the left edge, and I'm just going to basically recreate the measurement that I just made. So 4 feet, 1.5 inches. So I know that this line here lines up with the leftmost edge of my window. Next thing I like to do is measure from either the top or the bottom, again, whichever is shorter. And in this case, it's the top that is much shorter. It's only 1 foot, 2.5 inches. So I'm going to measure this down, 1 foot, 2.5. There we go. That is the topmost edge of my window. Now, rather than measure it from the bottom and from the right edge to get the bottom and right side of the window, I don't want to do that because those are big, long measurements and they're going to be tricky to get, especially if you're measuring by yourself, which usually I am. Instead, what I like to do is I like to actually measure how wide the window itself is and how tall it is. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. In this case, the window is 2 feet and 10.5 inches tall. So I'm going to take a guideline from my top guideline, drag it straight down, make sure your arrows are blue, and 2 feet, 10.5 inches tall. And then do the same thing for the width of the window, because the width of the window is shorter than the other measurement I would have to make, and it is 5 foot 11. 5 foot 11. And you can see that my feline assistant is double checking my measurements there. Looks good. Where all these lines intersect, you see I've got a perfect outline of my window here, and I know that that matches up perfectly because I've made all these measurements. So I'm going to snap to the top left corner, drag a rectangle down, push it in, and there we go, we have a window. Now this is something I want to point out real quick. I've gotten a lot of emails from people regarding making holes, specifically windows and doors. And it's a tricky thing to do, and a lot of people tend to have a little bit of difficulty doing it their first few times. So I'm just going to reiterate how this works. Basically, you've traced this shape, so you can now select just this portion of the face. You want to push in, And what you want to do is, instead of pulling out, you want to push it in until it snaps like this. And you see how it goes kind of all weird and purple and white? That is what we're looking for. That means that when I click, I've pushed it in the exact depth of the wall, and it's going to vanish when I click. Now, if you're having trouble getting that to snap, you might wind up with something like this, right, where you've actually pushed it too far through. If you're having a lot of difficulty doing that, what I would recommend is push it and then see if you can snap to your outer wall. So I'm just going to move up like this and snap to my outer wall like this. You know for certain that you're pushing it the exact depth. Or if you know the thickness of the object, push it through and just type in 4.5, and there we go. If your wall is 4.5 inches. If it's 6 inches, put in 6 inches. That is the easiest way to do this, right? Now I'm just going to clear up my guidelines. There we go. And then we've got doors. Now doors are actually a little bit easier if you ask me, because there's a couple less measurements you have to make. But before we continue, I do want to mention that this episode is brought to you by 3D Connection, makers of the Space Navigator. I mentioned at the top of the show I was using my Space Navigator. If I'm going out and modeling something, this thing is always in my bag. Because the alternative is using a whole bunch of keyboard shortcuts and mouse movements and getting this really jerky movement. You can see this is what I'm having to do here. The movement is not nice. It's very disorienting, actually. And for something like this, where you're trying to remember what wall is which, these really sharp, fast movements are very difficult to they're very difficult to work with. When you're using a Space Navigator, the model really becomes like an extension of your own hand. You hardly have to move your hand at all. You might not even be able to see the movements that I'm making right now. They're very, very subtle, but they can make a big, big difference. And you can see it's easy, it's gradual. I can go fast, I can go slow, I can get in really tight spaces. In fact, it's especially useful if you use a laptop like I do, because you don't necessarily have a full-sized keyboard with all of the extra keys that you would want when you're navigating in SketchUp. So having this one extra thing that supplements your existing keyboard and mouse or trackpad is an absolute lifesaver, and it really has changed the way that I model. I would highly recommend you check them out at 3dconnection.com, and I want to thank them so much for sponsoring this episode of SketchUp, a 3D Toolbox. Now, back to our model. So we've done the window, and now we just have the front door and the sliding glass door. Let's start with the sliding glass door, because it's a big, big hole. And this is where my technique of measuring in from the sides and the top first really comes in handy. Measuring in from the right side of that wall, it's 5'7". So I'm going to go ahead and take out a guideline and type in 5'7". That's the right edge. Now I'm going to measure in from the top, and that's going to be 1 foot 4.5. So I'm going to measure in from the top down 1 foot 4.5. There we go. I don't need to measure the height of the door, because just by measuring from the ceiling down, I know that the door goes all the way down to the floor, which in this case is 6 foot 6.5, right? I don't need to know that. I don't need to measure that. It just happens that way. But I do need to know the actual width of the sliding glass door, and that's going to be 5 foot 11.5. So let's go ahead and draw out another guideline, 5 foot 11.5. And that right there is my door. So with doors, because they go all the way down to the ground, unlike windows, I don't need to make 4 guidelines. I only need 3. So bit of a time saver there. Go ahead and draw that and push it through. Done. And now I'm going to use my shortcut where I can go to the Edit menu and choose Delete Guides. Makes it so I don't have to select each one individually and delete it. And then we've got our front door. Same basic idea. I'm just going to measure in from the left side first. That happens to be 5.5 inches, so I'll go ahead and go 5.5 inches. Then I'll measure from the top down, which is going to be 1 foot 4 inches. And then the actual width of the door, these doors are usually about 3 feet wide. So I'm going to check that, and yes, it is 3 feet wide. So I'll go ahead and measure here. Now with these kinds of doors, I'm measuring I'm not measuring the molding around the door. I'm measuring the actual hinged part of the door, the part that moves, because I'm going to model molding around this, but the molding isn't actually part of the hole. It's just a decorative thing that kind of wraps around the hole. So always measure to the seams between the door and the molding. don't measure the molding itself. And push that through. Delete my guides, and there we go. We've made a lot of progress. So we've got our walls and our floor, and we've got the holes for our windows and doors. I'm going to go ahead and triple click on my model to select everything, and I'm going to right click and choose Make Group. There we go. So now if I model something else on top of this, say I model a cube sticking out of the side here, I can select that cube and move it independently of this, of my walls and my floor. Now, one thing I am going to do real quick while I'm thinking of it, this is something that's very easy to forget when you're first starting out your model. I'm going to go to my window menu, and I'm going to open up my layers panel, and I'm going to go ahead and make a new layer, and I'm going to call it walls and floor. Just select this, choose entity info, and you can see this is assigned to layer 0. I want to change it to walls and floor, and there we go. Now my walls and my floor are on their own separate layer. Anything else that I model now is going to be going straight to layer 0, which I can then, of course, change to furniture or something like that later. It's going to make my job a lot easier. And also, bear in mind, I'm going to open layers again one more time just to show you guys something. When it comes to a remodel, we're going to be using layers quite a bit here because we can keep the way that this room looked before we started remodeling it as a separate layer, and then we can have the new layout on a different layer. So we can actually toggle back and forth between old and new. It makes a very interesting comparison, especially if you're trying to sell it to a client or to a roommate or something like that. So that is looking very, very good. Well, we made a ton of progress today. All of the walls and windows and doors are in place, at least the holes for them are, and the floor is down and the ceiling is up. And we made all of our measurements too. So you can see that there's a little bit of a system, and there's a way you can kind of make it so you don't have to actually measure every single nook and cranny. You can sort of, by process of elimination, figure out how long a certain wall needs to be by measuring the walls around it. So in our next episode, we're going to talk about texturing the apartment, and we're also going to put in the actual windows and doors. We have the holes for them, but we're going to put in the actual hardware next time. Now you might be thinking, isn't texturing usually the last thing you do? And usually yes, in the stuff that we've done. But keep in mind, we're remodeling this. So the sooner we get the textures in, the sooner we can see what this place looks like right now, and the sooner we can start making changes. So next time, we're painting the walls and we're laying the carpet. So I'll see you guys next time. I'm Cameron Harris. Goodbye, and good modeling.